How's it going, ladies and gentlemen? My name is RuffledRowlit, and today I want to talk about how Scarlet and Violet are going to be in their last year in 2024, and that means that the final Pokemon games for the Nintendo Switch have to come out next year as well. So the question is, are we going to be getting Johto, Unova, or perhaps are we going to get both of them? Now, this video is going to be in 6 segments, and it's a pretty long one, so feel free to jump back and forth, or feel free to just put it in the background and listen to it while you're staying here. Either way, let's get started. So first of all, before we actually get into Johto and Unova, we have to understand the release cycle of Pokemon games. See, Pokemon has been releasing games non-stop every single year since 2016, and usually Pokemon games follow a 3-year cycle. Now, what do I mean by a 3-year cycle? Well, basically, every Pokemon generation starts off with the new generation game, so that's games like X and Y, Gold and Silver, Ruby Sapphire, Diamond and Pearl, even freaking, Pokemon Sword and Shield or Scarlet and Violet. Those are new generation games. They're the ones that started generation. And then there's usually, about 3 years worth of games, and then we start a new generation after that. So for example, if we go back to Generation 8, it followed this exact formula. In 2019, you had Sword and Shield. In 2020, you had the Sword and Shield DLC, which was like the second year. And then the third year was, of course, BDSP and even Legends Arceus, which kind of bled into the next year. But overall, it was around that same time cycle, right? So usually you will have those 3 years of a cycle, and then after those 3 years, we start the next cycle. So for example, in 2022, we had the release of course, Legends Arceus at the beginning of the year, but the new generation also started that year, which was Scarlet and Violet. Then Scarlet and Violet is followed in 2023 this year with, of course, the DLC, and then next year, we should be having the final games for this console and for this generation, before we move on to the next generation, which is going to be Generation 10, which of course is probably also going to be on the next console. Nonetheless though, I just want you to understand this concept. Just keep in mind that this has stayed like this for basically the longest time now. It's been like this for over a decade, okay? Over a decade, almost 2 decades. It's stayed this consistent 3-year cycle. And there's a reason they do that. It's a way for them to schedule out their games and schedule out merchandise. It's just all reasonable between like how they do their stuff. But that's not all though. There is something to be said about the amount of Pokemon games actually coming out right now. And actually it does show in the quality of the games, as some of them are relatively worse than others. And of course, the work pressure has kind of forced Game Freak and the creators of the main Pokemon games to even give away responsibility for the first time, by the way, of the Diamond and Pearl remakes to another company like Ilka, who made BDSP. And as such, going into the future, we can kind of expect the output to keep going, as these Pokemon games are printing them money. Like, it's fantastic for them, not because of the sales of the games, but actually the existence of Pokemon games is more like a merchandising train and more like a commercial for the merchandise, right? It's just a way for people to get interested in the actual franchise, to then be willing to go buy the plushies, the trading card game, and stuff like that, which at the end of the day makes more money than the video games do. And the reason I bring this all up is because we've seen with like how things have been going lately, with BDSP and Legends Arceus releasing a mere 2.5 months between each other, opening up the door for a lot of possibilities. Now, the only reason I bring all of this up is to again talk about Johto and Unova and why both of them make sense next year, and also why we can kind of expect this formula to keep happening going forward. Now, first we're going to talk about why Johto makes sense in 2024. And there's a bunch of reasonings, there's a bunch of little tidbits and points that specifically point towards Johto happening next year. Now, first of these, of course, is just the hints you can find in the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet games. And then you might be asking yourself, what do hints have to do with anything? Why do I have to look at hints to figure out if a Pokemon game is going to be happening, or what does that actually have to do with anything? Well, here's the thing. Pokemon love to do that. Game Freak love to do that. They leave little hints in the previous games that point to the next games. There are, for example, hints in Sun and Moon that hinted at stuff that was going to show up in Sword and Shield. There are hints in Pokemon Black and White that hinted at Sun and Moon. There are always hints left behind, and we don't always know those hints until the next thing is revealed, and then we figure it out. But basically, let's take a look at some of the little hints that have been shown to us. For example, there is Johto GBA music in Kitakami. So the new DLC, there's literally Johto music in there. There's also the uniforms that you guys wear in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, where in Scarlet and Violet, vice versa, the patches on their arms are actually gold and silver. But that's not all. Billy and Onair are 2 characters that were introduced. They're most likely Nemona's parents in Scarlet and Violet, but their hair is colored gold and silver. I know it's a small thing, but again, it's small stuff like that. It's always small things. It's never never like massive, giant, in your face, here's what's next. It's just small things hinting it. Then there's also the fact that Apom and Gligar, the version exclusives in Kitakami, are both from Johto. They're version exclusive Pokemon in Kitakami, and they're both Johto Pokemon. And then there is all of Kitakami as a whole, right? Like all of that region seems like a reference to Johto. So let's start with the fact that Kitakami is based in Japan, and so is the Johto region. Both of them are literally based within Japan. Kitakami is more traditional and old school, same as Johto, whereas the opposite, the second DLC, Blueberry Academy, is more modern and futuristic, just like Unova, which is where it's literally based. And this also perfectly mirrors Scarlet and Violet's paradox forms and the whole theme of future and past that exists. But that's not all. Johto is also celebrating 25 years since its release in 2024, which is the perfect time for the revisit to the region, and also a good way to kind of cap things off and end off the Switch. Since the Switch era started in Kanto, the sister region of Johto, it would only make sense that the other region, well, that being Johto itself, should be the final Pokemon game to finish off this era of Pokemon. And also with the level of success that they've had, it just makes total sense, because originally Johto was supposed to be the final ever Pokemon games, but because of the success of the franchise, that ended up not being the last one. But keep in mind, that's not all though. Johto has also been not remade since Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which was back in like 2007 and 2009. So it's been a while since we actually have seen Gold and Silver. It's been a long time, and they've never really remade Crystal or anything like that, so there's a high possibility they might want to just go back and revisit it. And I'm gonna be real, the biggest reasoning again is just the fact that we haven't seen them in so long. Johto has not been revisited, has not been seen. Like, you can talk about, oh, but we haven't seen Sun and Moon, we haven't seen, you know, X and Y, but those are too recent. Those are way too recent. If we're talking about old generations, it's been the longest since we've seen Johto. Kanto was there in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, and we see it almost all the time because of the, you know, inclusion of Charizard and Pokemon such as that being just included all over the place. But my point is, Johto makes sense. We haven't seen it in forever. It has not been revisited since Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and also it'll be a good way to cap off this generation. And keep in mind, next year is the 25th anniversary, and you guys know how much Pokemon loves to celebrate anniversaries, and next year is the 25th anniversary of Gold and Silver. So it just makes sense to revisit Johto in some way or shape. How we're gonna do that, I don't know, but I think it's highly possible. Then we gotta talk about Unova, which also has a high possibility of showing up next year. Now, let's talk about the reasonings for it. For Unova, there are a few different reasons that actually lead to it, but I think the two big ones are hints in the games and mentions from leakers. Now, leakers such as Riddler, who is a legitimate leaker, by the way. The guy legitimately has information, he legitimately knows things, but he's been hinting at a lot of stuff, okay? He's been non-stop talking about different things that seem to be pointing to Unova. But let's go through some of these things. For example, we have hints in the Blueberry Academy. Like, literally, the Blueberry Academy is set in Unova. They literally mention it. It's told to us, hey, Blueberry Academy, it's in Unova. I mean, it's not in Unova itself, like, you know, somewhere on an island or like some part of it. It's just like an island outside of it. It's an academy that's within the Unova region, within its sphere, which is really strange because we never got, you know, any mentions to it back when we played Black and White, but it doesn't really matter. You do also have like the Duraludon evolution, which is going to be Arcaludon, which literally looks like the bridge from Black and White. Like, it's a straight up thing. Then you of course have Applin and Diplin, which in this case, Diplin is literally a caramelized apple, which is very much a American thing, but also the fact that we're getting a evolution for Diplin and the whole thing with, like, you know, the big apple, right? It's just a weird little coincidence. Either way, you also do meet characters in the Blueberry Academy which seem to be related to characters from Unova, which we know. For example, this guy looks just like, well, this guy. Basically, the characters look very similar to each other. Like, there's a lot of references to those. But I've got to say, the biggest one has got to be Leaker Ku. Now, Ku, of course, for those who do not know him, I'm going to just simply say that this fella has gotten things right all the time, okay? He leaks non-stop, he gives us riddles that kind of point us in certain directions, and he's been telling us, and he's the biggest reason, by the way, for the Unova hype, but he's been telling us that Unova is happening in some way or shape. His tweets have been referencing a Unova game for 2024 over and over again. He's hinted and made references to the original Dragon of Unova, he's referenced that what's going to happen next year, and even seemingly hinted at it being a paradox game. He did like this weird poll where he specifically like pointed like out a bunch of different things, like Unova, Black and White 3, which is never going to happen. Black and White 3 is not going to be a thing because putting a number 3 on there becomes a problem. But my point is still this. Like, it just seems like he's hinting a lot of stuff, and the biggest one is the Paradox game, a game possibly similar to Legends Arceus, which is set in either the past or an alternate version of Unova, that functions differently from our existing perception of the Pokemon games, right? Like something different. Like, keep in mind, no one expected Legends Arceus or a game like it to be set in the past. Like, nobody knew Legends Arceus was going to come out. Like, of course, Riddler knew because he was hinting at it back then too, but none of us as fans, those without any knowledge or inside info, had any clue that we were going to be getting a game set in the literal past. Like, everybody expected it to just be BDSP, right? To just be a regular Diamond and Pearl remake. That's what everybody wanted. That's what everybody expected. Instead, we got BDSP and Legends Arceus. And again, Legends Arceus was a total derailment of what we're used to. It was them trying out the open world concept. It was totally different. So whatever this Unova game, if it is real, based on what we've seen from the hints, from the leaks, from all that stuff, if it is real, it is going to be very different, possibly from what we can imagine what a Pokemon game should be like. It could be set in the future. It could be set in the past. It could be just like Legends Arceus, or it could be a totally new thing that we have never seen before. Again, we don't know, but it is being hinted at by the fact that there are references in the DLC and in the games, but there's also points from the leaker. Riddler who's been mentioning it over and over again. Now, I want to include this here, and I'll talk about this in a future video as well, but there is two things that Riddler specifically brought up recently, which are very interesting. He said, predict the title in 2 months, Palace, or something else, what will the topic be? Now, Palace is weird because he did make a tweet a while back too, where he specifically said, Dragon Palace, what would it be? He posted this a while back. It's been a long time since that came out, and that was also around the time when he posted this giant, poll where he says, what's on your wish list? Place your bets. Let's Go Unova, Legends Kyurem, Black and White 3, Paradox Unova. Out of all these, Paradox Unova is the only one that made no sense. And now he's made this tweet. Predict the title in 2 months, Palace ? Or something else. What will the topic be? Very strange. It doesn't fit with any of the other stuff that he's been telling us. It's just a bit random. In 2 months, that's a bit too early. We're only really in October right now, and in 2 months, is he talking about the DLC? Is he talking about the topic of the DLC, and why is he mentioning a palace? Again, he also posted this, original soup, original taste. The big question with these tweets, even with this poll tweet, is this referencing just the DLC, or is it referencing the next year's games? That's the part that's a little bit confusing. There are a few theories from a few different people. Some people are saying, for example, is this possible that, do you mean we could predict a Unova game title after the Indigo Disc comes out? So yes, is it possible that we're going to be able to predict what we're going to be getting in Pokemon, in 2024 based on what we get right here? I think that is the most logical situation. That whatever is being shown to us in the DLC might be able to give us the answer of what we're going to be getting in 2024. I think that's the most logical thing. But then he also says original soup, original taste in Chinese or Mandarin. Original soup, original taste. Now, some people have taken original to be referencing to the original Dragon of Unova. Some have taken it as original. We're going back to the original games, the original style of Pokemon, more set on rails, more, non-open world and stuff like that. That could be original, soup, original taste. Again, the mention of soup and taste is very interesting. I don't know what that could be in reference to. Maybe there's something from Johto or something from Unova, which could connect those two together. But there isn't really much else to say about that because I don't really know. There are a few theories, for example, Lumio's post here and Blazing Cinderol. He says original soup being a new game, not traditional remakes. Original taste being the traditional style, a linear, non-open world Pokemon game. That's my guess. So original soup implying it's a new Pokemon game, but not traditional remakes. So again, it's an original concept, maybe like an original concept, but it has the original taste. So it's an original soup, but it has an original taste. Does that make any sense? Like the word original here, I'm saying it too many times, but it can be a bit confusing. It could in one sense talk about something from the past, but can also talk about something original and new, right? They can be talking about oh, this is my original design. This is what I created. But you can also talk about originally that was how it was supposed to be. You get that dichotomy? The word works both in past and future tense. It works in both, the past and the current, right? It's a little bit confusing. As such, he could be talking about, that we have an original ID that's brand new, but it has the taste of how Pokemon used to be, right? Or we have an original ID from the past, that's now got a new taste. So like a thing you know with a different flavor. That's basically it. Think of an ice cream. That's not something that's wholly original, but it might have a new flavor. They might have had some new flavoring to it, a new style of flavoring to it. That's a bit different. That's not what you're used to. That's basically the way I'm viewing this. It's like basically saying two things at the same time. It's a bit confusing, but that's what he usually does. Blaze also says the Unova game next year has two versions, like Scarlet and Violet. I can't think of anything else that Original Soup and Original Taste could have that two versions. There's some other people saying, OMG, Original Soup and Original Taste happened. Unova confirmed the original dragon. Sora here says, Legends Kyurem is a reality, but the real question, what would you guys like the game to be set in, past or in the apocalyptic future? Yeah, Pokemon Legends with Original Dragon, which set a long time ago, one of the heroes of Truth and Ideal were the ancestors of Jetsis and N. Just again, a bunch of different theories. A lot of people are assuming, and I really mean it, a lot of people think this links back to the original dragon. Everyone else, oh my god, it links back to the original dragon. Me, an intellectual, yes, I suspected all along, the 19 Terra type is the soup type, which is funny, but again, I think the reason I'm bringing this up, the reason I'm mentioning any of this, is that I think that this is trying to tell us that we're going to get something a little bit maybe more simple, but different next year. Not maybe something as big in scale as Scarlet and Violet, or even Legends Arceus, even possibly, but something different, something that feels familiar, but still is different. And that kind of goes back to, and I'm going to talk about it further in this video a bit later in, but it kind of connects perfectly to what I was mentioning, that it seems like whatever game we're going to be getting, if it is a Unova game, it will not be a regular remake. We're not going to get Black and White 3, which is like what a lot of people thought we were going to get, or, you know, imagined. A lot of people voted here for Legends Kyurem. That seems like the thing that most people want, right? But it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case either. I think the answer is Paradox Unova. I think that's what we're going to get. A paradoxical, a version of Unova that isn't what we think it is. It is, you know, a different version of Unova that's just gonna function differently. And that's like one of the reasons I feel like that Unova could be the one game we get next year and Johto doesn't happen at all. But again, I'm inserting this part of the video in here after recording the first part of the video. So this might be a little bit out of there, you know, when I'm doing this, when I'm talking about it in the video, but we're gonna be keeping, you know, this on tab and we're gonna actually go back to it in future videos as well. So stay tuned. But nonetheless though, I just want to bring this up and mention it because it is really important. Again, he seems to be telling us we're going to be able to predict whatever game's coming out in 2 months. We're going to be able to, we're going to be able to predict what game's coming out in 2 months whenever the DLC comes out. And that might be related to Palace, what he mentioned earlier, right? Like the whole like thing here with the Dragon Palace. But like I said before, that doesn't necessarily mean we can't get some other stuff too, that we can get some other possible things too. Some people have tried to figure out like, hey, the palace thingy here, is this like, you know, reference to potentially like, you know, stuff we're going to find in DLC itself? Are we going to find the hints to it there? Is that what we're talking about? Again, anything is possible, but I just want to include this in the video. Now, I want to quickly inject this into the video. This is recorded after I finished the whole video was rendering, but I want to include this real quick. So basically, we were talking about Riddler and his tweet here, which was saying something like original soup, original taste. And then I got a response from Jan here. Now, Jan is one of the people who's in the community who actually does a lot of like research on these kind of things and breaks down a lot of the riddles. And they said, only if you actually know what the tweet means. And I said, I really do wonder now what the heck 2024 is going to bring, if the recent tweets ought to do with the next games, or if this is DLC stuff and we ain't seeing any Unova in 2024. Now, I personally don't think Unova is going to happen. That's not what I think, but I think a lot of people hope that that's the case, but that's not what I've been personally saying Johto since the beginning, and I'm probably going to end up most likely being wrong next year when Johto doesn't even happen, but that's still what I wholeheartedly in my heart think is going to happen. However, what Jan says here, only if you actually know what the tweet means. It's nothing good as Google Translate suggests. That's an idiom Chinese Pokemon fans only use to describe BDSP. Now, Chinese idiom, basically the text is written here is a Chinese sentence, right? It is in Mandarin, and basically it just, you know, if you translate with Google, it says it's just about soup, original taste. However, in Chinese, it turns out to be describing specifically what people feel about BDSP. Now, I misunderstood that and said, oh, wait, does that mean that like he's saying that we're going to be getting a Johto game that's similar to BDSP, or perhaps a Unova game similar to BDSP? If he's bringing up BDSP at all to begin with, and they say no. The term literally means faithful remake, right? In the Pokemon community. And then points out, you were all being so optimistic on a term that gives no hope. And I kind of got lost there because I was like, okay, So what is he trying to imply then? That people are expecting a faithful remake, but that Game Freak never delivers on that, I'm guessing. With Jan concluding saying, what he actually wants to mean is beyond my knowledge. He just tweeted faithful remake in this context. A faithful remake of what? He didn't say that in this tweet. And I just point out that that's a fair point, because that's the thing. He doesn't really point anything out there, doesn't really clarify anything. And then it says here, just to point out the actual meaning and put your guesses will do, I guess. Future Ruffle can take over the video and add in this context. Still won't change the video too much. That's true, okay? That's very true. Awesome. But thank you, Jan, for actually pointing that out. But basically, it goes back to this whole tweet and why we were talking about it. So here's the point. The tweet right there doesn't necessarily say that really anything. It could mean a lot of different things. It could mean, hey, we're gonna get a faithful remake, but remember, this idiom, this actual meaning of this sentence is a way to describe BDSP. Now, what are BDSP known to be? Well, they're known to be faithful in some way to, of course, Diamond and Pearl, but didn't include all the stuff fans wanted. They were faithful in too much of a way, so to say. Like, they didn't, add things that people wanted to see. They wanted more of a platinum type of remake and something to look more similar to ORAS than what we ended up getting. And then he pointed out specifically here, you're all being so optimistic on a term that gives no hope, which is very true. We all wanted a faithful remake, a good remake, but then people got disappointed when it was, well, actually was pretty faithful. If you think about it, Diamond and Pearl and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are very similar. They were a faithful remake, so to say. And again, it all goes down to like how you want to view this. Either he's talking about the original dragon and blah, 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 but that seems less likely now because of this whole like reference to BDSP and how Chinese fans use that to describe BDSP. That changes the meaning of this. That changes the whole thing. It changes how we view this post right now. And I had to include this because the video was already done and I wanted to just inject this into the video to just kind of add this point, because I think it's important that you guys know that you don't miss any context in case I get something wrong or somebody else gets it wrong, or the way we interpret it at first might be wrong from what it is in reality. But basically, there's two ways of looking at this. Either he's like literally referencing, right? Like, the thing I talked about, original taste, original soup, whatever, that is going to be, this original concept, but it's got like an original style Pokemon game, to it, whatever, that whole thing I talked about early in the video. It's either got that to it, or option number two is it's talking about something more similar to like, what's being mentioned here, that this is just him referencing BDSP, that we all wanted a faithful remake and then we got one and it wasn't exactly what people wanted, and that perhaps whatever we're going to get next isn't going to be a faithful remake, but rather it's going to be an interpretation of theirs, like a version of theirs, of what they want to, do with Unova, if they're going to be revisiting it in some way or shape. That's the way I'm looking at this right now. And again, it's all up for debate. I want to hear your thoughts and opinions, because this is one of those things where you guys need to share your thoughts, because I don't even know where to go with this. This like needs a longer discussion, which is why we might do a live stream on it. But let's get back to past Ruffle to continue the video. Now let's talk about why having both of them next year makes sense. Now the first reason for both coming out next year is logical. Both are being hinted at, okay? Both are being mentioned. We've seen them in Kitakami. We've seen them in Blueberry Academy. Johto and Unova are both being hinted to us. They're both being mentioned, and they're both being shoved into our faces, which is very strange. Why would they do two different generations being hinted at and not just one if one of those is going to be mentioned or recreated very soon? It just seems a bit odd, but both of them are being mentioned all the time. The only person that I haven't seen much in terms of Johto from is specifically Riddler. He hasn't really mentioned Johto, which is strange because that's the one that to me makes more sense for next year. Like, Unova feels less likely, Johto feels more likely. However, the leaker has not really mentioned anything about Johto, as far as I'm aware, but more so about Unova, so it is a bit odd to say the least. Then again, there's the other fact. Johto celebrates 25, and Unova has been mentioned over and over again, right? So that's the other point here. Johto is celebrating 25 years. It makes total sense. And the fact that Unova is being hinted all the time also points again in the same direction, that both of them should be happening next year. They already did it once, okay? They've already done this before. BDSP and Legends Arceus, they did it. They already did it. They released them 2.5 months between each other. So trying to argue that, no, we can't get both, it's impossible, is total BS. You guys know it is possible. I know it's possible. Back in the day, we never would have thought this. The only time they'd ever done this before was during the release of Fire Red Leaf Green and Pokemon Emerald. That was the only time we ever got two Pokemon games released in the same year. But ever since then, every Pokemon game has had 1 year, and then the next year is another one. They've never been so close to each other. So it's been exactly 1 year cycle between them. However, this was the first time with BDSP that they actually did it. The first time that they decided, okay, we're going to do this a little bit differently. We're going to do this somewhat different. And guess what? It seemed to work out. Both games sold really well, and they were released in the same time frame. So it is, again, highly possible. Like, just keep in mind, it is highly possible. Again, what type of game we're going to get? Again, like I said, we could get a simple remake for Johto, and then a more legend-style type or unexpected type of game from Unova. One that goes back to a more simple way of doing things with Johto, and one that goes a bit balls to the walls, tries things out with Unova. That could make most sense, and that way, they're still saving then the Unova actual remake for the next year. Keep that in mind. They can still save that for 2027 when it logically should come out. And also, it would be a good way for them to cap off the Switch era. Pokemon games tend to still release even after Nintendo moves on. Like Ultra Sun and Moon, for example, in 2017, which came out the same year as the Switch came out, we're still on the Nintendo, like, 3DS, right? They were still on the 3DS. And Pokemon didn't even have a Switch game until 2018 in November, which is like a year or almost like even 2 years, not really, but almost 2 years after the actual console came out with Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. So perhaps this is a way to get some of these like IDs they had in mind, some of these concepts they wanted to do, just get them out there and get people to be willing to buy them so they can start fresh for the next generation of Pokemon over on Nintendo Switch 2 or whatever it's going to be called. Now let's talk about why either one of these two could maybe not happen. Now the reason, it's a little bit hard to kind of justify either way, but basically the reasons it may not happen is that Unova, for example, might be too early to visit. Now I don't think we're going to actually get remakes of Unova, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in the video, but I just don't think we're going to be seeing any form of Unova remake. Like literally a remake is not going to be happening next year. I just think it's highly unlikely. And that's just like the one thing. It hasn't been super long since those games came out. It's been about 13 years. Next year is going to be 14 years, which, fair enough. You could say, hey, 14 years is a long enough time. They should remake it, which is fair point. But keep in mind, it's been longer since we've seen Gold and Silver. It's been even longer than that. So wouldn't it logically also make sense to say, well, hey, it's been a long time since we saw those games. So again, that's like one of the things that makes me feel like Unova is not going to be remade, at least not the way that we expect it, if it does actually end up, happening. Either way, it might also be just too much to put out 2 games next year. Like again, keep in mind, both games could come out next year, but it also could just be too much to release 2 at once. And also, they might want to take a step back and not release anything until Generation 10. However, I don't think that's highly possible. I just think that the only reason that Unova may not happen is that I don't expect it to be a remake. I expect it to be some kind of paradox game, okay? Literally, let's call it a paradox game. A game that is neither a remake nor a remaster, but a kind of own game, its own sort of game that's kind of different than what you expect. That's kind of what I'm expecting more with it. So that's like the only reason I would see where they wouldn't do it. And of course, if Unova doesn't happen, I think Johto could still happen, but it wouldn't be like a crazy game. It'd be something simple and small to cap things off. That's the way I view it. Now, let's finish off this video by talking about what kind of possible games we could get next year, like all the possibilities. And number one, and I'm going to type it up here in the corner so you guys can see what I'm thinking of. The number one possible option is, of course, Johto Remake, right? And when I say Johto Remake, I'm specifically talking about a remake that could be anything like a simple one, such as a Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee style of remake. That's the first option. Then, of course, we can replace it up here and specifically type in Unova Remake. That's another possibility, but I think it's less likely. Like, I would argue this one is the least likely one to actually happen. I don't think this one is going to be much of a likeliness because a regular Unova remake just doesn't seem like the case. Now, we did talk about Ku earlier. I talked about some of the stuff he said and talking about the originals and original taste, original soup and all that sort of stuff. I don't think that necessarily means that we're going to get Unova the original way it used to be. I don't know. But this is one of the possible games we could get next year. However, I think it's the least likely one. The one I think is higher possibility is a Legends Kyurem game or a Paradox Unova game. But let's start with Legends Kyurem. If it's a Legends Kyurem game, it could be set in an old version of Unova. That's a possibility. Then, of course, there is the Paradox Unova game. Now, a Paradox Unova game, this is the big one. This seems like the one that's being hinted the most. This game could feature two things. They could feature both Johto and Unova in it. This could be set in the future of Unova, in a future version of Unova where people have actually forgotten what Unova is. They have a new name for it. They have a new concept for it. Like, it's not the Unova that you and I know, it's a different one. The same way that Hisui became Sinnoh, maybe Unova becomes something else, right? Maybe Unova over time becomes something totally different. And we can see what that would look like in the future. Keep in mind, these games, Scarlet and Violet, keep having a future and past theme, so it makes sense that the future and past theme should continue. But again, this is one of the possibilities. Of course, there is a game that, has been suggested by, actually people like Kuro Blitz. Kuro Blitz said, hey, what if it's a Unova remake, but it has, plus Johto? Or, sorry, he did it in reverse. He said, what if it's a Johto remake and then Unova as post-game? Now, I think that's highly unlikely. I just don't think that's going to happen. But these are some of the possible games we could get. I think the most likely scenario are these three. A regular Johto remake, just a regular one, regular gameplay, regular everything, original taste, original flavor, baby. It's the original soup, okay? That's what I think is one of the possibilities if we're talking about Pokemon, Johto. For Unova, I think it's either going to be between these two. It's going to be between Paradox, right? And it's got to be between Kyurem Remake, or Legends, sorry. These two are the only options I can think of. I don't think anything else is really possible. I think these two are the possibilities we have, and anything besides this doesn't seem realistic. Like Black and White 3 doesn't make sense. Like Black and White Remakes doesn't make sense either, unless they are paradoxical, aka they're set in a different time frame, because otherwise they can't really do regular remakes of Black and White in 2027 when we should be expecting to get those remakes. To keep in mind, the reason I bring this up is just because I'm too addicted and I'm too on the nose with their schedules, right? I'm too on the nose with how they've done things in the past. And basically, Generation 9, currently, we are not in the remake year, okay? That was last generation. Generation 8 remade BDSP. Generation 7 didn't have a remake. Of course, they had Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, but those are outliers. And that's exactly what Legends Arceus and Let's Go Pikachu are. They're outlier games. They don't follow the formula. They break the mold. So, of course, they could be doing the same thing here. They could be breaking the mold and they're giving us a remake. But I do think whatever it is, it's not going to be normal. And that's something we already know from Riddler. Everything he's been telling us points towards something that isn't a regular remake. It's going to be something different. And that's something I wanted to emphasize and really bring up here, because I don't think a lot of people take that to heart and just run wild with whatever they imagine. But I personally think the most likely scenario, in my opinion, is we're going to get Johto Remake, a basic one, a very basic Johto remake, and a Unova Paradox game. That's what I think. I think those are the two options that make the most sense. Those are the two options that are the most logical, and those are the two options that just fit the best with what would make sense next year, right? Of course, the other option is we only get one game, and that game could either be a single Johto game, right? Or it could be a single Paradox Unova game, because I do not think we're going to get a Legend-style game the way we're expecting it. Everything seems to point to like that. Of course, the mentions of an original dragon could mean that we might get that, but nonetheless though, I just want to bring this up. And this is pretty much me summarizing the video. We have a few options. We can either get a regular Johto remake, we can get a Legends Johto game. That's option number 2, if we're talking about Johto. We get a Johto that also has Unova in the post-game. That's one. You can also just not get Johto and we get a Unova remake, a regular remake of Unova. We can also get Unova Paradox, a Paradox version of Unova, the way we think it's supposed to be, but it's still different, right? Maybe it has a similar gameplay to original Black and White in style, but then the actual story and everything is a bit different. We can also get Legends Kyurem. That's another option. And of course, we can get the Paradox Unova game, which has nothing to do with it, and it's a totally different thing, either set in the future or just a Paradox version of Unova. Again, there's a lot of possibilities, but that's pretty much going to be summarizing it for this video, guys. I wanted to do this one to talk about all the possibilities, because there's a lot of stuff going on right now. And we're closing in on the Indigo Disc DLC, which we're going to be talking about again very soon. But thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.